Hi everyone, my name is Afroditi Psarra and I'm a Greek transdisciplinary artist who is currently based in Seattle, Washington. I will talk today about the swatch that I contributed to the Having Friends in the Future remote event. So my personal swatch is entitled H Fractal Machine Embroidered Antenna. So this project is basically the continuation of a research that I started back in 2014 into wearable antennas for electromagnetic field detection. So I started back in 2014 with experimenting with antennas like coil antennas made with enameled copper wire and hand embroidery. After that, I continued the research by developing other type of antennas like dipole antennas, and eventually around 2017 I started exploring the idea of using fractal geometry in antenna design. So my motivation behind using fractal geometry is kind of like has two aspects. The first aspect is that the fractal geometry allows for a bigger length of the antenna in a small size, and so it allows for using different fractal algorithms and iterations of the algorithm to create antennas of different lengths that have different space filling qualities. And one of the good things of this fractal geometry is that it allows antennas to become multi-band, meaning that they can be tuned to pick up different frequencies, whether you select, the contact point to be in the center of the antenna or in like one of the smaller parts of the fractal. And also, depending on where you ground the antenna, you can filter it out from certain frequencies. The second part in the decision of working with fractal antennas was the aesthetics. This whole kind of like the geometry that characterizes fractals for me is really interesting. It's reminiscent of like traditional patterns of folk art from around the world. I'm originally from Greece, as I said, so there's a lot of like patterns from older times in Greece that resemble these fractals, but then also looking at, other countries like South America or like Central America, Mexico, or even countries in Africa or even Taiwan, there's a lot of patterns that resemble these kind of fractal shapes. And so the aesthetics motivated me into using um, these um, these shapes specifically. Another reference and inspiration for this project was this Japanese embroidery technique called sashiko, which is basically a hand embroidery technique to reinforce old fabric, and it's specifically like using white thread on an indigo fabric. And again, the different types of stitches of the sashiko technique resemble these space filling fractals that I started researching. So in this project, I'm trying to combine both my interest in like the ethnographic aspects of traditional patterns that were used in embroidery or in weaving and other types of crafting, but also the aspect of citizen science that allows me and any other person who is willing to engage with this experimentation to explore electromagnetic fields or radio frequencies by creating their own versions of these antennas. From a technical standpoint, the swatch is created using a digital embroidery machine, pretty much like the one that you see back there. That's a Brother Persona embroidery machine. And the choice of using an embroidery machine versus making it by hand is that, especially for these really complex shapes, like the H fractal in its third iteration that I'm using in the swatch, it would be like very laborious to do by hand, and it wouldn't be as precise. And creating the pattern and vectorizing it and doing it in the embroidery machine really allows me to experiment with different materials, like the fabric that I'm going to use to stitch it on, and also different types of conductive yarn that also affect the sensitivity and the resonant frequency of the antenna. I want to clarify here the difference between when I talk about like picking up electromagnetic fields versus radio frequencies. So electromagnetic fields are everywhere around us. A lot of are human-made devices like mobile phones or computers, or like transformers for charging stuff. They all emit different frequencies, or even like lamps like this one. So by using this type of antennas and a very simple like sound amplifier circuit, you can amplify those frequencies that these devices emit, and this refers to the electromagnetic field detection of these devices. And these devices emit around a frequency around 20 hertz, which is like a very low frequency that is usually not as perceived from the human ear. So by amplifying it, you're able to make it detectable. The RF sensing aspect of these antennas, the radio frequency aspect of these antennas, refers to picking up different types of radio waves. And radio waves are also everywhere around us, and they're used as a means of like broadcasting, transmitting, and receiving information. This takes the form of, the FM or AM radio that we're all familiar with, but there's other types of radio waves too, like, for example, Wi-Fi signals are radio waves too. They're transmitted at 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz. There's, all these like satellite communications. For example, weather satellites are transmitting pictures that they're taking of Earth from outer space at 137 megahertz. Ham radio, which is like the amateur radio. These are, amateur radio technicians that communicate one another, and this is transmitted at like lower frequencies. So there's a lot of different types of radio waves that one can tap into. So by using these fractal antennas and a device called software-defined radio, which is like a digital radio dongle, you're able to detect those radio waves, sonify them, and decode them in order to make them be able to perceive them and to listen to them. Also, there's a possibility of not using software-defined radio and making a specified analog circuit to pick them up. in which case you need to exactly know, where your antenna is resonant at, what frequency, and also doing some calculations to see how you can create a down converter that would make some of these frequencies that normally are outside of our hearing range, down convert them within the 20 to 20,000 hertz audible range that the human ear can pick up. So by open sourcing that, my purpose is to have more people be motivated and explore this type of technology. And by using craft, my purpose is to really first of all, break down the perceptions that we have about technical objects. My work really engages with this idea of um, opening up these black boxes that we consider technology to be in. So when we buy something, we take for granted that that's how it works without really understanding the inner workings of it. So I think that by breaking down technical objects and reconstructing them out of textile materials, you really engage into the process of producing the technology and also understanding how everything works. But it's also, for me, a political act too, because understanding how to make these technologies and using materials and techniques that are everywhere around us and connected to our personal and cultural identities, that gives you an immense power to really speculate about different futures or alternative presents even. So for me, there is a very strong political aspect into working with crafts. The second question that I would like to address has to do with a panel discussion that I organized together with one of my students from the University of Washington, Gabriel Ben Abdallah, last September, in the context of the R Networks conference in Toronto. So we organized a moderated discussion where we invited artists and designers working with craft in their work. Some of them are Amor Muñoz from Mexico City, Constanza Piña from Chile, Melissa Aguilar from Costa Rica, Siwei Chi from Taiwan, Audrey Briot from France, and Heidi Biggs from the United States. And we actually created this online event that you can access and you can watch on YouTube because it's recorded there. That was called Crafting Commons, a roundtable on cybercraft networks. So the whole idea behind that was that craft practices rely on the exchange and transmission of techniques, technical skills, tacit and explicit knowledge about materials and methods, but also on the circulation of common values and ethos, fostering shared mindsets and communities. And many of these communities around the world are developing and passing on these technical and cultural legacies to fellow practitioners by creating cultural and intellectual commons, by organizing autonomous conferences, camps, residency programs, and working collaboratively, bringing local and international networks together. Pretty much what Tribe Against Machine and Having Friends in the Future are trying to do. So this session proposed to bring together several of these practitioners to discuss their practices beyond the creation of mere artifacts and how they contribute to establishing self-determined communities and to fostering commons. And the third issue that I would like to address is how I combine old and new in my work. I think I really kind of talked about it when I was describing my swatch, but I'm really motivated by using traditional crafting techniques. Um, the reason that I started to use craft in my work was because as a media artist, I was trained to work with, electronic equipment and learn how to code. So I used to spend, and I still spend, a lot of time behind the computer screen. And working with my hands was something that was always very inspiring to me. From a very young age, my grandmother taught me how to embroider and how to knit. And as a kid, I remember spending a lot of time embroidering, cross-stitching things or knitting hats and doing stuff like that, and without really a necessary, a more conceptual framework for it, but I really enjoyed the action of making things with my own hands. So by combining these traditional techniques with electronics and creative coding, I think what really allows me personally is to create my own expressive language, and to also reflect on how some of these traditional techniques, how these old technologies, when combined with these new technologies, can generate new meanings and can also generate a new type of culture. Um, so I think that's why I also came up with this idea of cybercraft that I briefly mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Crafting Commons panel discussion. Um, I think that cybercraft kind of um, contains this idea of crafting things with your own hands, or with techniques, with tools that extend this use of the hand tools, and bringing together this idea of cybernetics that has to do with, the um, organization of autonomous systems, and how you can basically create a self-steering or self-correcting system. Um, and the cyber aspect of cybercraft for me also has to do with cyberfeminism and some of Donna Haraway's theory around the Cyborg Manifesto, or Sadie Plant's zeros and ones, and the whole notion of the female body as this sort of matrix of flickering binary information, zeros and ones, in a both in a very metaphorical sort of way, but also in a kind of literal sort of way. So by doing cybercrafts, I am able to create embodied technologies, but also using gendered techniques. So I think that kind of sums up what I wanted to contribute to the conversation. I hope this all made sense, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions on all of that. Thank you.